Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Around the circle and see all of our names. And I know for me, after about 30 weeks, I began to remember. We can start. I'm Jack.
George. Bob. I'm Steve.
Raphael.
Peter.
Clint.
Paul. John.
Snake.
Lee.
Which way are we going?
Sean.
Oh, I'm Roger. I think it was the guy.
Jeff.
Carl. Mark.
Marty.
Mike.
Sean. Well, I'm really happy to see Sean back today. Sean Hargens, who has been GBF a few times. He's pursuing a Ph.D. at California Institute for Integral Studies. And he's a student of Ken Wilbur, the author and teacher, which I think will be speaking about some today. And Sean has shared with GBF before the experience that he had living in Bhutan for about 5 months. Was it just last year?
Yeah.
Last year. So, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I always enjoy the opportunity to come and dialogue with all of you. Clint and I had been talking about how we might explore the work of Ken Wilbur in this context. And I think there's been a couple people over the last 2 years or so who maybe have spoken a little bit about Ken's work. But we thought a good entry point into his philosophizing would be exploring how he proposes to reconcile science and religion. And given that all of us are spiritual practitioners who, in general, are kind of stuck in a scientific world space, it seems like it's a place we all have an opinion about and have experience. So I thought I would draw largely on one particular book of Ken's called The Marriage of Sense and Soul, and kind of use it as a foundation to go into some of the other areas of his thinking, depending on where the energy in the group is. So as I speak, I would really prefer to have an engaged lecture style, such that as I'm presenting stuff, if there's things that aren't very clear, please raise your hand or get my attention, and let's have a conversation kind of as I go through, opposed to the style of me speaking for a half hour and then opening up to questions. I'd rather kind of be in response to the energy and the interests of all of you. So, how many people are familiar with Ken Wilbur? Okay, a few folks. Great. Has there been a speaker at GBF who's introduced Ken's work?
Oh yeah, we had Bert Parlay
Okay.
a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So actually, I also want to acknowledge this is Lee Robbins' idea too.
Oh, okay.
He
Great. Thank you.
You read Sense and Soul, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Excellent. Has anyone else read this particular book by Ken?
What is it?
The Marriage of Sense and Soul? Okay. Great. Well, obviously sense is referring to the empirical kind of worldview and science in general, and soul is referring to kind of the religious sensibility or the capacity for direct experience of the divine. And Ken is recognizing that this is one of the major problems we have in our postmodern world, is how do we bring these two things together, because they're often in tension with one another. And one of the key phrases that Ken throws around a lot is this idea that everything is true but partial. And by that, he's trying to emphasize that everything that's stated can be seen to be true. But the question then comes up, how big is the space in which it's true in? For example, I could say, red is a really kick-ass color. Okay, so that's true. That's true for me and maybe for a few other people who really like red. So it's true, but it's partial in that it's only true for a small group of folks who really like red. If I say, humans have 208 bones, that's true, and it's a much bigger truth, because that's true for almost all of us, with few exceptions. So when Kin looks at the issue between science and religion, he wants to see what are they saying that's true, and then how much space is involved with those particular claims. And he starts by looking at the issue of religion and its insight, and he's focusing on pre-modern religion and modern science. And the insight of pre-modern religion that he considers to be true in the largest sense is the idea of the great chain of being. And the great chain of being is this sense that there are layers of reality, and that reality is both complex as you go towards spirit and more subtle. So you see this in the idea of there being body, mind, and spirit, or you can even expand that more to be body, emotions, mind, psyche or soul, spirit. And to give one of its more complex articulations, this is Sri Aurobindo's version of the great chain of being. Start with matter, vegetative, sensation, perception, vital emotional impulse, lower mind, concrete mind, logical mind, higher mind or network mind, illuminated world mind, intuitive mind, and Satchitananda or supermind, which is also the Godhead. Wilbur's version of this is going from worldviews, magic to mythic to rational to psychic to subtle to causal to non-dual. So there's so many ways to, in a sense, kind of divide reality and the complexity of reality. But the truth that we get from pre-modern religion is that reality is this gradient possibility of experiences and ways of being in the world. The truth that we get from modernity is what Wilbur refers to as the differentiation of the value spheres. And here the idea is that, for example, with Plato you have a discussion of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And these point to three different domains of reality that exist in any given moment. The true, in modern terms, would refer to what's objective. The good would refer to intersubjective truth, or like morals or ethics. And the beautiful refers to the more subjective dimensions of reality. So Kin refers to this as the subjective, intersubjective, and objective dimensions of reality. And it was in modernity that yes?
I don't understand what you mean by pre-modern, modern, and postmodern.
Okay, great. That's referring to just more like the historical continuum of when these truths came into being. So pre-modern would refer to kind of anything before, let's say, like the 1300s. And then modern would refer to from like 1300s to about the 1900s. And then with Nietzsche, you start to see what's called postmodern thinking. So it's just kind of breaking up the time of history into those chunks. Is that helpful? Okay, great. So in modernity...
Can I add something to this?
Yeah.
This is my interpretation of Wilbur, so I'm not sure it's totally correct and comment on it. But the question is not just the time period, but what's the difference between those things? And it seems to me that the pre-modern, in very loose sense, could be described as the magical period, in which people had revelation and experience, and that was truth. And the modern was essentially the period of rationality, of logical positivism, of it's stuff out there, and we can check it out with our senses and with various kinds of instruments, measuring instruments that will be more exact, and so we can find out truth that way. And the postmodern period, as I see it, is a period of interpretism, in which it says, there are various views on this, but maybe there's stuff out there, maybe there's not, but what we make of it comes from us individually, and I think Wilbur would add collectively. So if you like, in terms of who are the opinion leaders in the pre-modern period, it's the priests, and in the modern period it's the scientists, and in the postmodern period, I'm not sure, perhaps the philosophers like Wilbur.
Yeah, great.
So feel free to disagree with that.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very accurate further clarification of that. Thank you.
The only thing I would add is that it's not. There's a lot of all three going on at the same time right now. It isn't like we're all in a postmodern era right now.
Right.
There's a lot of, I mean, you can just look at the Republican Party, or you look at fundamentalism in Christianity or Islam or whatever, and that's a whole lot of pre-modern thinking still going on nowadays.
Yeah, great. So. Thank you. And both of you feel free to add things as we go. Another way to...
There's also, we'll just add to that, there's also the puzzle that the modern period doesn't seem to have a method of determining ultimate values or goals. It doesn't fit into that rational perspective, despite Anne Graham's views.
So with modernity, Ken would suggest that we start to realize that if you look at experience closely enough, you'll see at least three non-reducible dimensions. Appropriate example would be the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So here you have the Buddha representing the truth and of the enlightened state, so subjectivity, at its most open and developed place. Then with the Sangha you have the community of inner subjects, and then with the Dharma you have the teachings or the objective truth of reality. Another area you see these divisions are with like hallucinogenic drugs, or any drugs for that matter, when you talk about the drug, the set, and the setting. The drug is the objective dimension. The set is what you psychologically and subjectively bring to that experience. And then the setting is the container, cultural or collective, that you are participating in when you ingest or take drugs. So you find over and over and over again these three divisions of the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective. And Wilbur writes at length about how each one of these domains has a long history of individuals and authors who have really explored, articulated, and in a sense proved that you can't understand any one of these dimensions through the lens of the other dimension. Okay? When science kind of takes the forefront with modernity, there's a differentiation of these three spheres, but then soon after that, you have science, which represents the objective sphere, colonize the subjective and the intersubjective sphere, and in a sense kind of take over those spheres and often deny that they even exist. So then Kim's looking at these two truths. He's looking at the truth of reality as being a very complex spectrum, and then the modernity insight that there's at least three domains of reality. So he's wondering, how do we bring these two things into relationship with each other? He starts by looking at the 5 ways science and religion have traditionally been seen as connected or disconnected. One is science trumps and reduces religion to, being chemistry in the brain or something. The second is more of a fundamentalist perspective that people will take where they just deny that science is of any value at all and that the truth of God is revealed through revelation or something like this. Then you have the idea of epistemological pluralism where, a scary word, isn't it? Meaning that any mode of knowing is valid, whether it's cognitive, emotional, somatic, religious, scientific, so that each way of accessing the world around us can have import, can have value. And so here, religion and science would kind of be seen on equal terms. Then you have the view that science, if you study it enough, will lead to religion. And we see this in a lot of the great scientists who really single-focusedly look at aspects of the natural world to the point that they get to a place where they say, there must be a God, because this is just too fabulous, this is too amazing, and so they just kind of pop into kind of a space of opening to the divine. And then you have the postmodern perspective, which is this sense that everything is of equal value and science is just another meta-narrative, as is religion, and they're just big stories about how we relate to the world, and none of them are really true. They're just ways we make meaning in our complex settings. And so while this approach, like epistemological pluralism, would say that both science and religion are on equal footing, the postmodern perspective is, they're on equal footing, but neither one of them really has any claim to truth at all. Whereas the epistemological pluralism would say they're on equal footing and they are saying something about truth in the world. So then Ken goes in and he talks about this idea of the new paradigm. And he suggests that paradigm, which is a term that became popular with Thomas Kuhn in a really famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, became hijacked by the New Age movement. And they used this term, the paradigm, the new paradigm, as a way of kind of promoting their own kind of narrow view of the world. And so he goes on and on and on about how Thomas Kuhn, when he talks about a paradigm, is referring to injunctions that ask you to do something in order to discover the truth of something. Whereas in a lot of the New Age movement, there's the sense of you don't have to do anything. You just kind of there's this sense that let's transform the world, but there's not a lot of people who are actually doing meditation or taking up spiritual technologies or practices that he looks at kind of the boomeritis or the boomer generation, and how within the boomer generation there's very few people who are talking about the new paradigm who are actually in sanghas or doing some kind of spiritual practice. And so he says that this is a problem because you get a lot of people who are talking about this new worldview, but they're not actually doing the subjective work required to transform into that new worldview. Does that make sense? Okay.
There actually has been that's been identified in the study of Buddhism in America by Tom Tweed, who calls it nightstand Buddhism. People who have a short book of the Dharma on their nightstand and they read this. And I was actually told by a publisher recently when I was thinking of a book proposal, what we need is a book on Buddhism and Christianity with everything is reduced to a couple of pages per chapter because people don't read any more than that.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah, Buddhism for Dummies. Yeah. So,
which actually exists if you go out.
Actually, it's not necessarily good.
I did even see a book which was called Sex for Dummies. I thought, now I've seen it all.
And it comes with an inflatable doll.
So Ken looks at three kind of historic... Yes?
I read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions a long time ago. It's always stuck with me as a very powerful thought from that.
Yeah.
A statement which maybe I don't fully grasp, but it was that, when he talked about what happened when Franklin discovered the electricity, and reordered all of the ways that scientists thought, not all, but many of the ways, and I keep wondering if we're not on the brink somehow of a paradigm, in which the limitations of some of the ways in which we're thinking will vanish, or not vanish, but be reorganized, so that we can better understand this integration or this non-integration.
Yeah.
We're talking about integration, non-integration, separation.
Right.
I don't know if that anything to say about that, but it's just.
Yeah, I think it's very true. I think Wilbur's concern is that being a Buddhist practitioner himself, like he's very aware of how our ego likes to hijack different things as a way of keeping it within its comfort zone. And his concern is that there are so many people out there who will speak about the new paradigm, and it's actually a way of their ego kind of hijacking the rhetoric of the new paradigm without them actually having to really do the hard work of transforming themselves, moving through their fixations, opening their heart, and so forth to everyone.
I think the mystery of it was a mystery to me, not a mystery, a magic mystery or something, that when it happens we won't know. The beginning of it, when it happens, we won't know.
Yeah.
Because with Darwin.
Yeah.
It took him a long time for people to really get the idea from a little book he wrote.
Yeah, and just to respond to that, and then you, is that's the other part of Ken's point, is that in Structures of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn actually maps out about 100 different paradigm shifts. And so Ken's wanting to say that, like you've mentioned, that it's not going to be this radical revolution that just takes over the country in a fortnight. It's going to be a lot of small incremental steps that occur all over the place, and it will be such that we probably won't even see it happening. I mean, we feel it happening, we see it happening now, but it won't be this radical storming of the Bastille. And it's that he points to as kind of a red flag on kind of some of the egotism and narcissism that's involved with this. But yeah, so you and then,
let's see, were you going to cover some of the interior, exterior quadrant issues later? Okay.
Yeah.
No, just wait.
Okay.
Yeah, I forget who first suggested the metaphor that what's happening in the modern world is like the brain, and what's happening in the brain, different folds, it's folding upon itself. So all these are like different folds of the same consciousness, so to speak, that they're starting to form a new consciousness in a way. An objective thing, illustration of this would be like the internet. We're developing lots more intercommunication. And when you start talking about that, one thing that suggested to me immediately about this spiritual and objective was Teilhard de Chardin's idea about tangential and radial energy existing both at the same in matter.
Yeah, and Wilbur actually takes a lot of his insights from Teilhard.
I was thinking that.
So Ken points to history and looks at 3 areas that this attempt to integrate science and religion has occurred before. The first one that he talks about is the Romantic movement, and associated with a lot of the poets and artists, and Keats and Schelling, Blake, and the German Romantics and so forth. And Ken says the reason that this movement failed largely to reconcile science and religion is because they were making what he calls the pre-trans fallacy, that they were confusing pre-rational dimensions of reality with trans-rational dimensions of reality. And as a result, what they often would do was promote a returning to ways of being that were actually less complex than real spiritual dimensions that include rationality and go beyond rationality. And you see this, for example, in the environmental movement often when folks in deep ecology talk about returning to the hunter-gatherer way of being, or ecofeminists talk about returning to a horticultural or goddess communities. Not that we shouldn't move towards, some of the insights of those, ways of being, but not in a regressive fashion. And Ken goes on and on explaining kind of a lot of the nuances of this.
And the other place that's prominent in the world now is fundamentalist Islam.
Yeah.
It's the same.
Exactly.
Return.
Yeah. And then the second domain where there was a real strong attempt to bring these two things together was idealism. And idealism is very similar to romanticism in a lot of ways, but one of the important differences is idealism posits a evolution towards spirit, a movement towards complexity and towards the divine. And the idealists actually had a lot of deep, intuitive and direct experience of the Godhead and talk about it in beautiful, beautiful passages. The problem with idealism, as Wilbur sees it, is they didn't have what he calls a yoga. They didn't have a way of replicating the results of their own direct experience. So when they would be talking to someone, they would just explain what their direct experience of God was and not know enough to say, and you need to do X, Y, and Z in this way for this amount of time in order to have that same experience. So as a result, people who would hear what the idealists were saying, if they weren't having those direct experiences themselves, they had to just take it on faith that was a part of reality. So there weren't pointing out instructions, there weren't meditative instructions, there weren't types of yoga and technologies that allowed anyone who was interested in what the idealists were saying to take up those practices in order to discover for themselves if those realities existed or not.
Who were some of the leading idealists? I never heard that term.
Idealists would be like Schelling, Hegel, Schiller, Wordsworth to some extent. Yeah, he's kind of one of those people who's both a romantic and an idealist. Emerson, yeah, definitely.
Is that the same as trans-romantic to the romantic too?
Yeah, and these cross over a lot.
It's actually Hegel, I think, would be the big guy in there because his notion that everything is Geist, which we can't translate into English. It's one can't translate. So and everything is the Geist working itself out, and all this is just that happening. So this isn't really real.
Yeah. So in a sense, idealists are the romantics who put an emphasis on evolution or a move towards spirit.
Was Taylor Day-Chardin be considered an idealist?
Yeah. In a way he would, as would Sri Aurobindo. And Ken Wilbur is often considered an idealist as well, for that reason. But
and then Ken's stuff, of course, is heavily dependent upon the teacher who lived in Switzerland towards the end of his life, Jean Gebser.
Yeah, definitely.
But he's not known. He isn't at all well known in the English-speaking world. His book, The Ever-Present Origin, is really difficult to get into, but there is an introduction to it by Feuerstein, which is easy to do.
Yeah, and Gebser's another one of these people who kind of maps the complexification of worldviews and consciousness. So then Ken looks at the third attempt, which is postmodernism, which just kind of relativizes everything to an equal playing field, but doesn't really do a lot to integrate them. And the three insights that Ken finds very valuable about postmodernism is the idea of constructionism, that there is not a pre-given reality out there, but rather there's an interaction between the knower and the known, such that there's some stuff out there, but it's only known in relationship to the subject. the other important aspect of postmodernism is contextualism. And this is the idea that truth never exists outside of a context. And this is very similar to the idea of I like red, or there's 208 bones in the human body. It's like those are true, but they're only true within a certain context. And then the third important insight of postmodernism is this idea of integral aperspectival, which comes from Jean Gebser, and it's the sense that there's many ways of knowing, and they're all important. And
Can you say that wonderful word again?
Gebser, Gebser, integral aperspectival. So, like perspectives, like aperspectival means like many perspectives, and then integral is that they're all important and they're all needed. Yeah, some of these words are like, and because I'm at school at the time, sometimes I even forget that they're so crazy. So after Kin kind of maps out these domains and kind of this historical trajectory of trying to attempt these things, he makes his own proposal. And it's the idea that drawing on the great chain of being, Kin says, okay, let's at least acknowledge that there's the domain of flesh, or the sensory world. There's the domain of mind and thinking, and then there's the domain of spirit. Okay, so he says pretty much most traditions and most people will agree on those three broad domains of being. He says, okay, so given that, let's look at what consists of valid knowledge in any one of those domains. And he looks at science and the way science comes up with valid knowledge and kind of creates a framework that he feels applies to all three domains. And that framework is that there are three strands to valid knowledge. The first strand is that there's an injunction. There's a direction to do something. Look through the microscope. Look through the telescope. Watch the animal eating, berries in the forest for, a long time, and so forth. That there's some direction that if you want to know what bears do, you have to go study them. If you want to know what cells do when you pour salt into the water, you have to look through the microscope. The second part of valid knowledge is you actually do what's being asked of you. You look through the microscope and you report what you see. Or you watch the bear in the forest and you report what happened. And then the third part is that you have to dialogue with other people who have also done the directive. And you have to compare your notes and go, okay, well, when I sat in the forest and watched the bear for 6 months, this is what I saw. And then someone else says, well, that's different from what I saw. So you create a dialogue of, okay, what's true here? What can we say is true, and what part is my interpretation, and what part's maybe more objective, and so forth and so on. So Kin says this is a very viable framework for deciding what's true and not true. He says the problem with science is that they constrict this framework to a narrow empiricism. And that if you take this framework and apply it...
What would you define empiricism?
Empiricism being just a hyper-focus on what's measurable. Either, exteriors, things you can touch or feel or see, measure with, all kinds of different instruments and so forth. And...
basically, what the senses can sense. That's basically what the senses can...
Yes, exactly. What you can know through the world by the senses.
The senses can sense or can be made into something. Yeah. That the senses can sense. It can be brought things which are extremely far beyond human size or human range of the surface of the senses by means of microscopes, telescopes, and other kinds of things can be brought into the human range, and then we can say, well, it's this long, this heavy, or whatever, and then that's all there is. I think that's what he's trying to say.
So what we need is a telescope to see God, and then we can believe.
See, that's what Kin says the problem is that science makes that claim in a sense, that they're looking for God through the telescope. And what he wants to say is that if you want to know the truth of the mental domain, then, for example, the square root of -1 doesn't exist in the sensory world. It exists in a mental plane of understanding. And the only way you can prove that is if you learn math, if you develop a familiarity with equations, you do the equations, and it's all a mental thing. It's not something that exists in the empirical world. And this is one of the places where Ken says that science doesn't even adhere to its own requirements of narrow empiricism, that it really can't, that it has to go outside of that and draw on the mental sphere, but then it will deny the mental sphere at the same time. And so he points out these contradictions and kind of these ways in which even science is having to make use of ways of being that it denies. And then, for example, with the spiritual domain, it's like meditation. If you want to know a God from a particular tradition, then, if you meditate for 20 years and do these kinds of mantras and these kinds of visualizations, and you're likely to have these kinds of experiences. And then you compare notes with other people who have done that. And that's essentially what the traditions do. And so Ken says at several points that the advanced meditator is very much like a Ph.D. person in the sciences. And if you have like a Ph.D. in physics, astrophysics, there's just a few people who really understand the kinds of things that astrophysicists talk about. And a layperson is not going to be able to kind of dislodge those truths just by saying, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Similarly, the advanced meditator should be given that kind of legitimacy such that the lay scientist can't just easily dislodge their claims to truth by saying, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Because just as the astrophysicist has to go for literally 20 years of education and then 10 years of research to get to the point where they really understand those claims to truth, the advanced meditator has to go through 20 to 30 years of a very similar kind of training. So Ken spends a lot of time kind of pointing out these ways of looking at a broad empiricism that very much honors the way science operates currently in its best moments, and also values, the insights of the spiritual traditions that have accumulated over the last 4,000 years. And so that's kind of the general thrust of what Ken's doing in this book and his work in general. And yes.
Can I add a little bit more
Please.
About interiors and exteriors?
Yeah.
And it's actually from another text of Wilbur's, of Brief History of Everything, I believe.
Yeah.
What he's saying is that science is looking at exteriors, and it reduces things to parts, atoms, molecules, and so forth. Whereas the other part of knowing is interiors, which Sean was just talking about, but an example might help. And so to adapt an example of Wilbur's, let's imagine that you've decided to go to the health food store to get a box of ginseng tea. Well, the strict reductionist scientist who says it's only empirical stuff would say, hey, all that's about is that your neurons have been bounced around and they were set in their path, and that's it. That explains, and that made your legs move, and that explains the whole thing. Whereas the person looking at interiors would say, well, no, that's not it. I had an intention, a thought, a desire. And that's the interior stuff on the individual level. In addition to which, there's a collective interior as well, from which you've absorbed the idea that ginseng tea is good for you. And there's a collective exterior which has created the market system and so forth in which that health food store exists. So you have interiors, exteriors, individual, collective. It's the four quadrants that he's talking about. And Wilbur is not throwing out any of that. As Sean pointed out in the beginning, he's an inclusivist rather than an exclusivist. And so he says, hey, it's great that scientists are looking at the brain and can actually see brain patterns. There's just been some recent research on, it's very interesting, on people who have chronic back pain. If they have very solicitous spouses, it actually gets worse in the presence of the spouse. I mean, this is literally research that's been done. If the spouse is not very solicitous, it doesn't. And if the spouse isn't there, it doesn't get worse. But so you can see in some way they're responding to the solicitude by providing what's asked for or getting feedback. And that's all stuff about interiors. And the spiritual issue then is that spirituality resides within interiors. Actually, there's two levels in Wilbur's work, who is, I believe, more or less of a Buddhist, just like there is in Buddhism. On the relative level, which is what I was just talking about, spirituality resides in the interiors. It's not to be found out there in the world of things. On the absolute plane, as Wilbur said after this long session we had with him during the summer, he said, well, I can't remember the words he used, but yeah, but all the work I've done is just really bullshit. Because on the absolute level, it's just the cosmos. The cosmos is the ground of everything, both the interiors and the exteriors, and the paradigms and the romanticists and the interpretists. It's all just manifestation of the oneness. So it's really the relative work of Wilbur that we're looking at mostly. Otherwise, it's just the same as Buddhism.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if he ever addresses the question of whether science is of any value at all. I mean, doesn't every scientific new thing create a problem? I mean, it was designed to solve a problem, but it always creates a problem.
Yeah, he does actually talk at length about this dialectic, which he calls the dignity and disaster of everything. So that everything that's created, be it through science or through art or anything else, there's the dignity, there's the part of it that's very beautiful and that serves God and serves relationship and is very helpful. And everything has a shadow side, and it has a disaster, and it has a problem aspect. And he'll often talk about how, like technology, certain technologies have allowed us to live longer, which is a dignity. And then certain technologies, some of those same technologies wreak havoc on the world, and that's the disaster. And so Wilbur's challenge to us is, how do we hold the dignity and disaster of everything together? The same with intimate relationships. As we all know, it's like there's a dignity and disaster, and you have to learn to have a whole object relationship with the person that you love instead of making them all good or all bad. Just as we need to do that with other cultures and look at, instead of seeing how indigenous people are all good and modernity is all bad, how do we hold the complexity of looking at what's good and bad about modernity and good and bad about indigenous cultures, for example? So he says that's really the challenge, is to hold that. And he says that as things get more complex, there's more dignity and there's also more disaster. And so the stakes get higher. So you and then you.
Yeah, it's just an example of how what I was referring to earlier about things begin to unfold on each other. Recently, I was watching Deutsche Welle on TV, and German scientists have been able to quantify or measure. Like when I raised my hand, my decision to raise my hand, I didn't become conscious of it. The thought was there, and then I became conscious that I was going to do this, or that I did do it. And that, to me, that starts shedding a lot of light about the values of meditation. So where you get away from just the conscious reflection, you have to below that, which is what this research apparently is referring to. So it's just
that's good. Thank you.
I was with you until you said something pretty alarming, which is the person who has 20 years of religious practice has valid knowledge.
No.
Or could. It's
Right.
a good bad thing.
Right.
Because I came up with Pat Robertson, Osama bin Laden, and the Pope.
Right.
That it's a massive commitment to delusion, in my opinion. And
Right.
it made me feel good about my commitment to secularism.
Yeah.
Because once you posit that those people have a valid truth just because they meditated or prayed, those are the three examples I came up with.
Right. Yeah, and
Very alarming.
it is, and that's an important point to raise. And Ken actually speaks at length about how do we get around that issue, and because it does raise the issue of within those small communities that is taken for valid knowledge, but in dialogue with the larger community, then it's not. And so that's how you start to kind of weed out.
But only secularism allows the dialogue. Once they take over, the
Right.
dialogue is ended.
Right, and Kin makes this point at length about how that's the dignity of secularism, is that it allows us to move away from the dogmatism of religious beliefs or even scientific fanaticism, and that it's only in the modern and postmodern world that we're able to really navigate those kinds of waters and make judgments and say, no, that's not helpful. Those kinds of ways of being, those attitudes, like those, deny realities, and what we're wanting to do is really honor the multiplicity. So yeah, it's a great point.
Let's be careful not to absolutize the secular aspect too. I mean, you brought up Pope and Osama bin Laden and Robinson. The Christian tradition and the Muslim tradition are very extensive and rich in the doctrines and outlooks and the people and the cultures. Islam in Indonesia is very different from Islam in Saudi Arabia, and whereas the Vatican is famously dumb in regard to sex, it's at the forefront of interreligious dialogue.
Yeah.
And furthermore, not to cast illusions on secularism, but it has absolutely the same problem. And this was the insight, the postmodern insight of Kuhn in the nature of scientific revolutions, that ultimately there's no more way of knowing that they have truth than that there is or don't, than that the Pope or the practitioner has truth. And what, for example, when we discuss astrophysics, I imagine that nobody here is capable of reading the mathematics and doing the experiments to prove it. So how do we get to that point? We have a belief in some advanced practitioners of science who, within their particular community, have attained status and belief. And ultimately, it's still nothing more than collective agreement.
Yeah.
That's what the truth is. Sean, I was wondering, we only have a few more minutes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say this is such a rich subject that because fundamentally the implication is how then shall we live?
Yeah.
That's the point of all this. We've just barely touched on it. I do want to give you 2 or 3 minutes to, which is all we have left, to sum up or reiterate.
Okay.
So that we can pull this together.
Yeah.
Maybe we can continue to talk about this maybe at another time, certainly after we break.
Yeah, definitely. Great.
This touches on so many fundamental issues.
It does.
We're pursuing a Ph.D.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to think my time and money has gone to a worthwhile place. I think it's so hard to really begin this conversation because Ken has written 20 books himself, and there's obviously so many issues that need to be raised and explored. But what I really love about Ken's work is I feel he gives us a framework that creates a shared language to explore and navigate some of the difficult issues that arise as we look at these kinds of things. And I feel the framework is successful because it really articulates the horizontal dimension of our reality, that being the subjective, intersubjective, and objective aspects that permeate every moment. And it also really explores the vertical dimension of reality and the many ways in which we have multiple types of consciousness in ourselves at any given moment, and that we often speak and act from different ones at different times. And by really holding the complexity of both the horizontal and vertical dimensions of the cosmos and drawing on the many, many disciplines that have explored and articulated aspects of those, Ken's framework really allows a very rich and complex way of exploring and trying to ask and live these questions, because I don't think the quest is to answer them as much as it is just to live them. And I think you can live them more fully if you have a complex language that allows you to articulate them and make discriminating distinctions that honor just the plethora of valid nuances that exist in any one of these topics. So I'll end on that.
Question: If the book is so vast, what would be a good first book for somebody to pick up to learn Ken's thinking?
A really good one is just recently came out called A Theory of Everything, and it's just like 150 pages, and it's very accessible and gives a lot of real world examples. Another one that might be very interesting for spiritually inclined people would be Integral Psychology, because it focuses more on kind of the interior dimensions of ourselves, and so those two books really serve as great introductions to his work.
That was a good book too.
Yeah, and A Brief History of Everything was mentioned. That's very good.
Yeah, between A Brief History of Everything and The Theory of Everything, I found The Brief History of Everything a better introduction, though it is a little longer.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it seemed better.
Yeah.
It also bring like the brief history is longer.
Right.
Yeah.
one of those contradictions.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. It was great to be here again.
So do we have announcements? Peter is our host today.
Right, the usual things. There's some goodies out there, tea, a Donegal. We recently talked about our expenses. Minimally, they're $100 a week. Up from there, if you count the newsletter, Hamilton House, and other things. So you can do the math to figure out what your donation might be. Sometimes people go out for brunch afterwards. I don't know if you're available to continue the discussion in that setting.
Yeah.
If you have tea, wash your cups, brush your teeth.
We're having a Thanksgiving dinner at Bob's house. I forget Bob's last name.
Ross.
And there are directions outside, and he's asked that we please call him and tell him what we're going to bring, so that everyone doesn't bring pumpkin pie, or everyone doesn't bring.
That wouldn't be so bad.
It wouldn't be. I'm a dessert person myself. Maybe we should all. But
I went to dinner which had 13 potato dishes. It should be really good.
yeah, it should be.
It's a beautiful place too.
What's happening?
Hamilton House is once a month a group of GBFers. I was just there yesterday, as a matter of fact. Prepare a meal at the Hamilton Family Center, which is a shelter for families. And Jack was there too. And GBF has been kind enough to budget a certain amount of money to buy the food, and we prepared great meals. Like yesterday, pre-Thanksgiving, we had like big glazed hams with pineapple rings and cloves, and we had mashed yams, and we had rice with onions and peppers, and we had cranberry apple pie for dessert made from scratch. So these guys eat great. Usually they just eat stuff that's warmed up out of cans. So they really appreciate it. Half the people that eat there are kids. So it's just an engaged cruising thing. There's going to be an article in the upcoming newsletter that's going to talk a little bit about it. But it's a really wonderful project we're doing.
And I'd like to add about money situation that our economic situation is going down substantially from last year, and the contributions so far in the current fundraising drive, in which there were letters and envelopes in the last newsletter, are less than half of last year. And since I'm writing thank you letters, I also think it's interesting that most of the names of the contributors are people that I've never heard of from Canada and Ohio and whatnot. And so we need more contributors from people who come regularly to GBF. So I was just reading about John Kennedy today, so ask not what GBF can do for you, ask what you can do for GBF. Make a contribution.
Is it appropriate to ask what would be a reasonable amount per person to?
They generally, I can tell you what they generally range from about.
I'm sure you have received your newsletter. So
they generally range from about $25 to $100 with a couple of $500 contributions in the last 2 years.
The weekly donation that we request is like $5 more, if you can, less if you have. That's the standard pitch.
Thank you. It's been.
Hi, George.
Just sitting behind you.
Okay. Just a reminder, talks are available on the internet at the GBF website, gaybuddhist.org.
Anyone else? We have taken to closing by standing in a circle.
Yeah. Let's have us sink into our feet, feel the hardwood floor, feel our hearts open, feel our minds open. I'd like to dedicate the merit that was generated today by being embodied beings in dialogue and groping and exploring and hearing about Ken's work and his efforts and bringing our own concerns to bear on the issues raised and pointed to. And just have all that inquiry and openness swirl into a big ball of compassion and wisdom and go out and serve all sentient beings. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.